Afternoon, everybody. Thanks for coming to this session. I'm Alistair Hudson, Director of Middlesbrough Institute of Modern Art, and
soon to be.
Yeah, the clock's ticking. I'm joined by Charles Esche, Director of the Vanabbemuseum, who has come all the way, especially, to come back to Manchester. And I was saying, in a way, maybe the interesting thing about this moment is, certainly for me, is that in February, I'm to take up post at the Whitworth and the Manchester Art Gallery here. Both of us, Mancunians of a sort, in a time and a context of big change in the world and worrying times in many ways. In a way, what's happening is I'm kind of coming back to my roots to a certain extent, at the same time as Charles has relinquished his British citizenship just very recently. I'm a Dutch citizen. So in a way, kind of two polarities. And I was interested in a way to have this conversation now, before I kind of begin whatever it is in Manchester, as a kind of sounding board in terms of looking at how we might construct a museology or a way of working within the broader context for the future. And Charles also has been a great colleague, friend, and ally for many years now. As I guess what I call the coalition of badly behaved museums, who really, the Vanabbemuseum, have taken a very strong position in recent years with the decolonisation agenda, with really proposing other possibilities in terms of how we might operate outside of that modernist bubble. And we're going to talk about some of that today. But as I was saying yesterday in the introduction to the audience's section, I think it's really a good moment to look at a wider understanding of how museums can get involved and start to actually shape and direct our understanding of culture. And I think to do that, some things that we don't do, particularly in the UK, actually, I think, is to look at the bigger picture and to look in quite detailed ways at the circumstances that have created our current condition. I think very often we respond to it, but there's a lack of conversation around the hidden things or the things we suppress in our history. So I think that's one of the key reasons I kind of wanted Charles to come along and contextualise some of our current issues in the UK from a wider perspective as someone who's been living and working in Europe and internationally outside of this country for some time now. Mm-hmm. So, Charles, welcome.
Thank you.
We also chose this image
to start with, yes.
Because when I said to Charles, "Oh, would you come to the MA conference? It'd be great to have a chat with you." You immediately said, "Oh, we should have that image. We should have this cartoon from the Evening Standard." And maybe you should, just introduce that image and explain why you thought of that.
Well, I think it's interesting. In the sort of preparation for this and talking with you and also sort of doing some research and reading maybe more assiduously than I normally do, the kind of what might be called the founding myths of Britain in the contemporary literature, so particularly in the media, and I would think as much the Daily Mail as the Guardian, but those source materials, probably the Daily Mail tells us much more about Britain than the Guardian does these days. And it seemed to me that there were in a sense, two images. We'll come to another one in a second. But although Britain has existed since 1707, so it's a country that's 310 years old, which is a lot older than the Netherlands, where I live now, which basically existed since 1830. There seems to be 2 points of, we could say, founding myths upon which much of the understanding of the current British context are based, and this seems to sum up one of them. And to the extent that this is a myth, I think we can unpack it. But this is an image from 1940, from the moment when, just after Dunkirk, after the fall of France to the German forces in 1940 and the signing of the Vichy Agreement. So it felt at that point, at least that was the rhetoric, that the United Kingdom and its empire, because it's still an imperial power, and I think we'll come back to that, is alone at that point in relationship to Europe. And this, of course, feeds a particular narrative. let's say that history has no relationship to how things actually were. Yeah, we learned from Vanabbemuseum and various people that history is not has no relationship to anything we can imagine as being factual or accurate. So one of the mythologies of Britain, one of the interesting mythologies of Britain, is this idea that it has an antagonistic relationship to this sort of subcontinent, because essentially Europe is a subcontinent. Yeah, it's really Northwest Asia, we could call it much more realistically than we could call it Europe. So this subcontinent, its relationship to this subcontinent is one of antagonism, and that somehow the mythology that's been built up, and I think this was seems to have been very present in the last few years, is that there's always an idea in which these sort of perfidious Europeans are trying to impose something which the British spirit does not accept. And that's in a way the narrative that produced Brexit, which is partly what we're talking about. So in looking at this cartoon, I came across an article in 2011 in the Daily Mail, which used this cartoon as a rehearsal of the history of separatism of the United Kingdom, of Britain, from Europe, and how from Henry VIII onwards, British history has always been driven by an idea that it must turn to what Winston Churchill called the open seas rather than Europe, and which has constantly been repeated. Now, in a sense, this story seems to me a story that is that museums have a responsibility either to propagate or to counter. In other words, that most museums are history-writing machines. I think that we can understand museums as having a relationship to material evidence, the stuff that's in the collections, whether that's art in our case or other material in other cases. But that stuff says very little on its own. It has very little capacity to speak without being contextualized in some way. So this narratives that we construct in museums seem to me to play directly into the question of, for instance, in this case, what Britishness might be. So I think if in 2011 in the Daily Mail, this story can be told of splendid isolation and how this was essentially the narrative that captured the 52% or whatever who voted for Brexit, then as museums we might ask ourselves, or British museums might ask ourselves, and Dutch museums, I would equally say, might ask themselves, what are the narratives that we're telling that produce that kind of, that belief in that particular trajectory of history, in which from, even from the idea that the British trading power started with the blockade of Antwerp, and therefore there was no longer trade with Europe, and therefore they had to look abroad through Henry VIII, on through the Armada, and through the building of this overseas empire. How is that story, because if that's one of the problems, that narrative produces this outcome which 48% of people feel fairly unhappy about, and maybe an outcome which is not desirable in terms of international relations, then how is that narrative to be changed? And it's not going to be changed necessarily, however much it's motivated by economic forces and austerity and exploitation and marginalization of the centres, which we can talk about. It's also generated by that historical belief that this is a sensible decision. And that's a historical belief which is propagated by certain sources. And museums seem to be one of the places where either a counter-narrative or, if you want, a strengthening of that narrative might take place. So that's why it seemed an interesting point to start, because it's a historical document, this, but it's also a document which is, of course, a fallacy in a way. I mean, the Second World War, if Britain had really been alone in 1940, by 1942, it would have been under the occupation of Germany. It's clear that this was not sustainable as a position, and the only reason that it proved to be a sort of heroic image of victory is not because of this British soldier, but it's because of above all, the Red Army in the Soviet Union, but also the United States and their involvement in it subsequently. But that's not part of the narrative. Yeah? That's not part of the narrative that we tell ourselves as a narrative around Britishness. And so this becomes the narrative which in 2011, and I think subsequently, even Googling it, it's been a reference which has been, if you look at the sort of curve of the use of it since around 2011, building up to the referendum and then the success of the referendum from the point of view of these people, this was an image that was used increasingly to identify the values of being alone and therefore the values of voting against these perfidious Europeans.
Yeah. And I suppose in a way, this image is the one that it's kind of burned on our retinas, or increasingly burned on our retinas, not actually the image itself, but what it's saying. But how does this follow through in terms of the museum? Where does this put us in terms of our behaviours and our psychologies in terms of the museum as it stands at the moment? Because in a way, it seems to me that a lot of institutions are certainly playing to this at the moment, or avoiding it in certain ways.
Or perhaps avoiding it because it's an awkward question. I mean, if this is a founding myth, then I suppose we can go to this one, which is in a way the other founding myth, yeah? Which is the mythology that actually the empire was an idea of white civilization as a substantially ethically good value being imposed upon the rest of the world. And I think, again, however absurd that might sound to sit here, it's still something which hasn't really been addressed. And this is not only in Britain, but also in Europe. But I think that the important point about this image, maybe in contrast to the other one, is this is one which could potentially be shared across Europe. And I think this is one of the tricks, in a way, that the European Union, in its foundational myths, has really missed, and perhaps one that has brought us to the point we are now, because Europe is not in a great state either, with or without the United Kingdom. There are problems that need to be sorted out, and maybe it will be easier to sort them out without Britain. I think that there are positive aspects to Brexit for us in Europe. But nevertheless, one of the interesting aspects of the founding myth, I think, which is again going back to history and how museums tell stories, is that one of the few common historical experiences that the Western European states had. Yeah, so we could say from the Algarve to the Shetland Islands, something like that. This strip of Western Europe, yeah, the seaboard strip of Western Europe. One of the major uniting experiences is the experience of colonialism, of being the colonizer. And what's interesting about the European Union is that it was founded upon, we can say, one myth, one principle, which is that after the Second World War, which produced the end of those empires, essentially, yeah, and the assertion of an American and Soviet empire over the top of that, that at the point of that of the European Union, the idea was, of course, never again to war within Europe, or within Western Europe at least, and never again to the Holocaust particularly. And that was seen as an aberration, an exception, a state of extreme exception, which we could, through ensuring that we don't go down the same sort of political discourse, and ensuring we don't end up in the sort of the crash and burn of Sieg oder Untergang, this idea of complete destruction or complete victory. Yeah, we end up in a situation where we can avoid that happening again. But the problem was that story, the story of the Holocaust, the story of the Second World War, was never really connected to this common experience of colonialism, which extended across from the Algarve to the Shetland Islands, if you like. Yeah? And so colonialism as an issue within Europe was left to the individual nation states to struggle with on their own, to try and find some solutions to how to come to terms with this horrific history. So Germany, in a strange way, was helped through denazification to come to terms with its horrific history. Less so about its colonial history. That was, again, not connected. Yeah? And there are lots of reasons for that. There's, Zionism comes into this, and the need to make it exceptional. There are lots and lots of reasons. But there's also a reason that it was easier, I think, to produce a German scapegoat for the whole history of colonialism than it was to accept it into the body of the European Union and to say, this is our common heritage. Our common heritage, the problem that we have to deal with if we are to contribute to the 20th and 21st centuries in a way which is going to be less destructive than our contribution as a European culture from 1492 onwards, yeah, from Columbus onwards. If we're going to be able to do that, then we need to come to terms with this history. And this coming to terms with this, yeah, the coming to terms with the past. In German, you have a one word for it. Yeah, in English, you don't, because it's not an issue somehow. Yeah, the fact that you don't have a word for it is also because it's not an issue. Yeah. So you can read it in the vocabulary. This question is something that I think dominates a lot of our discussions today, because if this statistic is true, and yeah, of course, all statistics can be made to say anything. So are 60% of people proud of the British Empire in the United Kingdom? I don't know, but I mean, somebody asked the question, and this is the result that came out. But if this is true, you know, if you asked the German people about National Socialist time, it would be less than 60%, I think. And yet there's not a radical difference, is what I'm suggesting. And the same for the French, or the Spanish, or the Portuguese, or the Dutch, or the Belgians. The Luxembourgers, who are one of the original, are not that guilty of colonialism, but that's the only exception. So of the original states that formed it, and then later Spain, Portugal, the United Kingdom coming in later, all of them had an experience, including Italy. All of them had an experience of colonialism. And yet it was never, ever collectivized. And by collectivizing, I think maybe there could be a help. So one of the propositions might be, is why is there not a discussion between the different colonial trajectories, the different national isolated discussions around colonialism and how to come to terms with it in those different European countries, which museums could actually facilitate. They could construct those kind of discussions. And maybe by constructing those kind of discussions, the sort of divisions that we're seeing, not only in Europe, and not only between the United Kingdom and the splendid isolation of the United Kingdom and Europe, but also within Europe, that they might actually be less stressful, or less pertinent to our current analysis of situations. Yeah, because that's really the dominant discourse. I mean, I think, you know, reading the papers for this, the discussion of Brexit is far more active here than it is elsewhere in Europe, or not elsewhere in Europe, of course. And this is not Europe anymore. But it's within Europe. But nevertheless, it's this question of how on earth Europe can address its own history is something which I think museums have something to say about, and I think is not being done.
Yeah, but then do we not also then need to understand the mechanisms post-war, post this moment, that created that inability to talk about this, in order to understand why we're not. So, for example, when we have the issues around, you know, do we pull down the statue of, whoever it is, you know, the colonizer, or do we keep it up but then contextualize it? You know, it's either up or down. It's just that's the solution. I mean, it's kind of almost like a distraction to the actual inherent problem itself.
Yeah, I mean, our analysis within the Vanabbemuseum is, you know, we're about an hour on the train from Maastricht, so we're just a little bit away from this treaty that was signed in 1992. Immediately after the end of the Cold War, or more or less immediately after the end of the Cold War, that I think represented one way of trying to answer that question, but I think it's a way which has more or less failed now. And that way was to say, actually, we don't need to deal with this at the level of the emotional coming to terms with the past that was demanded of Germany, for instance, in the 50s and 60s. We don't need to deal with this on the level of having a narrative of who we are as a collective and what that we might be able to produce. We can deal with it on the level of the market, that basically the market will solve all these problems. That what we can do is we can hand it over to the exchange of goods and services on a European and a global level, and that will be the way in which we'll solve the relationship between the colonized and the colonizer. We'll solve the relationships, the tensions in ourselves between who we are and what corporations want us to be. Yeah? So the idea, for instance, of trickle-down, which essentially is something that's developed in the 1980s in the Anglo-sphere, but then comes into Europe around 92 with Maastricht, and the failure to set up a social Europe or any kind of concerns around the quality of life in Europe in a way beyond the market, beyond freeing the market. That idea of trickle-down is something that became the solution to the questions of how to decolonize. How to decolonize is to try and make these enormous sums of money for corporations and then desperately try and take the crumbs from the table and try and create a social welfare state within Europe, to try to create development aid, this notion of development, of course, being very problematic for the former colonies, so that they will gradually come and share the fruits of this market. And that was basically it. Yeah, I mean, of course, the beauty of it, the reason it was so attractive to politicians, is it meant they didn't have to do anything. beyond free the market.
And
they had no responsibility.
Continue to make more money as well at the same time.
And of course, they could continue to have very nice lifestyles, which is no doubt part of the attraction for it. But I kind of don't think that necessarily they're evil people. Yeah, I mean, some of them are, yeah, for sure. But I mean, I think the majority of them are not. So it's not about a sort of an ill will towards the European idea. It's not about saying we don't want these questions answered. I think they genuinely thought that the market would free ourselves psychologically, emotionally, socially, from these very questions, which we're now seeing in these images. These two images that we've shown, these are not images of the free market. They don't really relate to questions of the free market. I think you see in the Brexit vote or in other votes that are AfD in Germany and things like that, you don't necessarily see people choosing their economic self-interest in those votes, or at least not their economic self-interest alone. They're choosing questions of how to understand who we are. And those questions are answered those questions seem to me legitimate. Yeah? Maybe we can decry the answers if we want to be, elitist and exclusive about it. But the questions can't be denied. Yeah? And why have those questions come to the forefront now? Partly because what little vision this market solution had, I mean, in this country you had, Blair and Brown and these people, who basically were the people who instigated this system in this country. The trickle down, the crumbs on the table, and then to redistribute those crumbs. Yeah? And it worked for some time. I mean, I think the Labour Party did reduce child poverty and things like that. There was an element where that went. But as soon as those crumbs stopped falling from the table, which happened in 2008, and you could say, they stopped falling from the table not only because there was less on the table, but because the table got higher sides as well and kept them more on the table. That at that point, then it no longer functioned. Yeah? So the crisis of the model of Maastricht happens in 2008, and we've spent 10 years desperately trying to reinstitute that very system that produced the crisis in the first place without any capacity to imagine the world otherwise, if you like. And that's, again, another role, I think, which art, at least, might have. If we can't imagine the world otherwise within the field of art and culture, then we haven't got much chance of imagining it in the world of politics. Given the pragmatisms and the power, the systems of control of power which exist within politics. They are subject to the imagination. And that imagination, or art, does have a purchase on that imagination in a different way from the political. So if we can't imagine the world otherwise for the last 10 years, then I think it's partly because these kind of images are not being dissected, and the problems of these images are not being analysed so that we can imagine them to belong to a different kind of history, to the history that the Daily Mail tells us of splendid isolation, for instance, in this country. But one thing, just to show this, very well alone. Yeah? But I think it's important to say that the United Kingdom is not alone. that what manifested itself in this Brexit vote is something which is true across Europe. I don't know if you can read that one. Yeah, you can, more or less. No? But it's basically showing the statistics, which are relatively high. The German one is wrong because they haven't got the latest election, and it's now about 14% for the RDF. But other than that, it's more or less on time. So you're talking about between 10 and 25% support for what we could call proto-fascist, if we want to be a bit more provocative, proto-fascist parties within Europe. Many of these parties are also against the European Union and want to have their own Nexits and Frexits and Gexits and whatever else. Yeah. So that process is also underway. So I think, as well as feeling happy or sad about your splendid isolation, you should also feel that there are common kind of discourses across Europe, and that in that sense the United Kingdom is not so isolated. It's actually a product also of a particular subcontinental, we could call it, move, which seems to be very legitimate, a subcontinental move against or understanding the exploitation that was inherent in the Maastricht Treaty and inherent in this solution of the market as the way that we're going to come to terms with our emotional, social problems with this history.
Yeah, but then in a way, for me, the question is, how do we actually develop these models? How do we develop this way of working or working through this actually to activate it? So we could kind of get to the level of discourse and the level of understanding, but I mean, I certainly find in the UK, and certainly in the existing models of, certainly in the world of contemporary art and modern art, that our institutions are complicit in this as well. So it becomes increasingly difficult to make that step to, because a museum, an institution is also, it's dependent upon these structures itself. It's dependent upon capital, on markets, on certain communities, on behaviors, on the art market, on speculation and investment. It's totally wrapped up in this machinery. So for me, I mean, it might be worth going on to maybe just talking a little bit about the Internationale, because in this situation, working in Middlesbrough, which is this, one of the places left behind. This within the UK context, Middlesbrough is kind of probably the most acute manifestation of those who got left behind. It was the highest Brexit voting ward in the country. And it is kind of like the dark epicenter of it all, for all the right reasons. Yeah, but then out of that, the hope was you could always find a way of working out of this.
I mean, I think one of the other consequences of this Maastricht drive to privatization and marketization and all that is that it produced also, and this is maybe more true in the United Kingdom than it is elsewhere, but it's also true elsewhere, produced a flight to the centres, to whatever centres we might call the capital cities or the major economic centres. And it really, and I think it was particularly true in this country where we are now, that everything became focused on London as the only economic engine. Yeah, I mean, basically there is nothing else economically outside. If you look at, again, for this talk, looking at sort of productivity figures, I mean, London is doing quite well in productivity terms, but the rest of the United Kingdom is a complete desert. Yeah? Nothing is happening. Nothing's moving. Nobody's buying anything. Nothing. It's you could basically forget it economically, and apart from the suffering of humans, it wouldn't actually have any effect on the statistics. So, at that point,
in which circumstances you also get managed decline as well. I mean, this is also part of the equation.
Well, I mean, it is managed decline. I mean, what's going on in Middlesbrough? It's not managed decline.
Exactly.
I mean, you've got huge areas. I mean, that's managed decline is happening. It's not something which is.
We should have shown that lovely photo. We should have had our lovely photograph of Margaret Thatcher in Middlesbrough that we did a show about it recently, which is this great. It's basically called The Walk in the Wilderness, and it's taken in 1987 of Margaret Thatcher walking across the rubble of the Wrightson steel factory that was demolished. And it was very interesting because we had a BBC debate on the radio in the show, and it was amazing how at the same time, it's a bit like this image of the Britain very well alone. Yeah. For some, it's about 50-50 of some people locally going, oh my God, this is an image of that evil witch Thatcher, who demolished our industry, she demolished our support systems, it all went. But at the same time, there's another 50% who say, no, this is a great image of us losing that kind of dirty, filthy past and going it alone as, this service industry nation.
I mean, I suppose you could say that what produced Brexit or what produced Greece. I mean, Greece could be the Middlesbrough of Europe in a way. Yeah, you can also see those parallels.
They should rebrand it like that.
Exactly, it might work for the tourist industry. Greece is doing really well in tourist industry. So,
there's a foundation myth.
But if Greece is the Middlesbrough of Europe, I suppose it's also that what you have there is unmanaged decline rather than managed decline. I mean, managed decline is kind of preferable because it would imply that there was a certain concern for the people who lived there. And I don't think the British government has any concern for the people in Middlesbrough beyond the fact that they voted for Brexit, which maybe messed them up a little bit. And I don't think that Schäuble has any concern for the people of Greece. I mean, he certainly hasn't demonstrated it in any meaningful way. So I mean, there's a kind of unmanaged decline, which is what's going on in Europe, and I think this unmanaged decline is quite threatening, and it does produce this stuff is produced by that, and I think a lot of the, again, I don't think these people are evil. I mean, I don't think they want to see this. Yeah, I mean, they realise that Europe has enough of a history of this kind of politics to know we know where this ends up. Yeah, we really know. I mean, in Europe, obviously, the mythology of Britain is that this was the best time in Britain and the Second World War was a wonderful moment. But in Europe, it wasn't. Yeah? It wasn't seen to be such a success. And so within the European continent, and this is why maybe the removal of Britain from Europe actually helps in certain ways, then we can start to address some of these questions more precisely. Because this is very threatening. Yeah, when in Austria you get 30% voting, or almost 30% voting for the FPÖ, it's worrying, because we know where that goes. And I don't think people that are voting for them deny that anymore. That's the danger. I mean, this never again has become from, never again no, to never again kind of why not? Yeah, what was so wrong with it? I mean, that's beginning to become one of the questions, and I understand it as well, because if you're faced in Middlesbrough or in Greece with the kind of impositions of authority that are going on, where every single element of agency is taken away from you. If you imagine, there's that great line in the pulp song Common People, about and watch your life slide out of view. I don't know if you know that, but listen, it's my generation music, but I mean, there's a great line where he talks about the common people, what's it, I can't remember, drink and fight and screw and watch your life slide out of view or something. And that watching your life slide out of view, that's what's presented for a vast majority of people there. And I think, museums are interesting because in a strange way, museums are anchored in provincial places.
Yeah.
Yeah. Of course, in the United Kingdom, the Tate is completely dominant within the art field, but there are, and you represent many of them, are institutions that are working in all these places which are sliding out of view. Yeah, just as Greece is sliding out of view. I mean, do we talk about Greece anymore? No. Do you think the economic situation is much better in Greece? No. So that process is not something that politicians will feel accounted for until there's a scream. That's the only moment in which they'll be heard. And I think Brexit was a part of that scream. And this is part of that scream. Yeah? And it's why it's saying, what's wrong with never again? Because you're not offering us anything else. And it's not that people that are voting for these parties are bad people as such, nor that they want some sort of devastation, but they feel they've been devastated. So they've been destroyed and devastated, and then how do you respond to that? And I think that's the conundrum that's faced in Europe at the moment.
Well, also, there was a scream, and then it was back to business as usual. There was an immediate response, as I was saying, but, by Theresa May saying, yes, we will listen, we will, work for everyone, etc., etc. But then we're back to business as usual, as the banks and everybody running the system again in the same old way, because there isn't another idea. So the question then is,
what's the other idea?
What's the other idea? Where do we get this from? And maybe
I would say that the question of the decolonial and the term that we're using in the museum a lot is the demodern, is how to think about the problems of modernity as connected very much to the problems of coloniality, and coloniality being not something which is only in the past, not something which existed because of direct state control, but something which exists within what Walter Mignolo, for instance, calls the colonial matrix of power. The colonial matrix of power is still in place. It's reproducing itself. I think recently a colleague of mine who's sitting here told me that I think 68 of the richest entities in the world are corporations, not countries. 68 of the 100 richest entities in the world are corporations rather than countries. And those corporations are reproducing the colonial matrix of power. They might not have they even have a flag, but it doesn't have quite the sort of national associations of the unionist flag here, for instance. But nevertheless, it is a fact that colonial matrix of power still needs to be addressed. I think so I think that the museums then, in their small way, we can make tiny contributions, but I mean, collectively, we have a voice. And if, as we're arguing here, this historical narrative is the thing which is maybe as determining as economic conditions. Yeah, I'm being very un-Marxist here for a moment, but let's say that these two are actually at least related to each other. At least that it's not that only economic well-being or misfortune is the only contingent for value systems. Yeah? If that's true, which I think it is, then museums do have a responsibility to tell, or an opportunity, maybe it's not even a responsibility, what responsibilities do we have, but an opportunity to tell a story around the decolonial, and that's something that I suppose we're trying to do.
Yeah. Well, in a way, what I find interesting as well is, in a way, this sort of lack of knowing what to do. You see in the micro scale as well. So, when in Middlesbrough again, for an example, in very extreme circumstances. You know, when you're director of a museum, you get to talk to the mayor and the city planner and the industries and all these sorts of people, like the decision makers, the guys up there. The people on the street say, oh, it's all the council's fault. It's all it's the man. But then when you're actually sort of sitting at the table with them, you realise they sort of run out of ideas. They themselves, on this micro level, they kind of go, have you got any ideas about what we might do about housing? Have you got any ideas about what we might do about, the homeless people? And they're sort of scrabbling around. And I think maybe in those circumstances, there is a role for, if museums generally do become civic entities, if they reclaim their status as sort of the vessel in which all of society, all of its constituents can represent themselves and tell these stories together. Through telling of those stories, we can then begin to create a narrative collectively.
I think, no, absolutely. I mean, you said the word scrabbling, it reminded me. I mean, in a way, you're never going to get any new ideas if you've gone through the full permutations of the 7 letters in the Scrabble set. Yeah, and that feels like it. I mean, you need to pick up some new letters because these letters, you've spelled every word you can and you're still looking at it and seeing if it can spell another word, and it can't. So clearly you need to renew the sources for the narratives that you might want to tell yourself. And I think that's what politicians are saying when they're saying there's nothing else to do. They're not saying there's nothing else to do. They know there are other things to do. There are other things that have been done in the past, but they're not willing to do them because they don't fit into this Scrabble, into the 7 letters on their board. Yeah, and so they go, well, that's the universe. No, sorry, this really small little window is the universe, and that stuff outside, we know it exists, but this is the universe. So I think that's partly the problem, and I do think that the artistic impetus, the capacity of humans, individuals, collectives, to find ways out of that universe of the 7 letters, if you like, to extend this Scrabble metaphor way too far.
Keep going.
But to do that, I do think that lies in our capacity. But it means, I mean, maybe we can just show, it means addressing some of these questions directly. I mean, sorry, this is all other stuff, but this is the Vanabbemuseum that opened in 1936 by a Mr. Vanabbe, like the Tate or like other institutions like the Whitworth. I mean, there were people, real individuals behind this, and it was often private or public-private initiatives that allowed these things to exist. The reason that this exists is because of this. So this is in what's now Indonesia, and Vanabbe was a cigar manufacturer. And so all the wealth of the Vanabbemuseum, the very existence of this, is down to the women who are standing here. Now, if we understand that this is as at least as much an Indonesian institution today as it is a Dutch institution, that has lots of implications for our programming, with working with contemporary Indonesian artists. It has lots of implications for the narratives that we tell about the museum. So this story, and this story, this is Mr. Vanabbe right at the back looking at the camera, and then you see the 3 princes from Delhi, which is in Sumatra, near to Medan, in the middle of central Sumatra, visiting the factory in Eindhoven. This narrative needs to be constantly present in the museum. In the first thing that you encounter needs to be this. Now, I don't know how much that's true. I mean, I think Whitworth created itself because of the screw, the patent on the threaded screw or something like that. I mean, that should be there. That industry was the basis that was responsible for that. And I'm sure you can find, if you analyze that, I mean, that was like searching 5 minutes on the computer. But I mean, if you analyzed what that threaded screw did and what it achieved, then you'd have a narrative which should, in a way, be there. And I think it's interesting that the Rax Media Collective, for instance, which is an Indian collective, which is, to the United Kingdom what Indonesia is to the Netherlands in many ways, are showing in and I know this is your new place, I'm sorry, but I'm kind of shocked that there's no reference to colonialism in that exhibition. I mean, there is in the work, absolutely, but in the way it's presented, in the narrative that's presented in order to talk about that work, it's completely absent. Now, why is it completely absent? It feels to me that that's like eliminating this picture from it a little bit, yeah? I mean, the fact that they were invited and things like that, you can say that's a step towards it, but maybe that's not sufficient step towards it. Maybe we need to explicitly say that there's a relationship which is still ongoing, and that relationship is something that people need to take account of. So it's not sort of an autonomous artwork that some Indians happen to have thought up, but it's a result of a history which is the history that would implicate, here and there, would implicate the centrality of a post-industrial city like Manchester, with the ongoing industrial cities in Bangalore or in India, wherever. Yeah, kind of. No.
Yeah, but then maybe it's also worth just talk about maybe some of the examples of how this this way of working might materialize itself. I mean, I could certainly think of...
Yeah, maybe you can also from Middlesbrough.
Yeah, I mean, so for me, what I found it very fruitful in this context is actually then, rather than simply through discourse, we were talking about this a little bit yesterday in one of the sessions we were in yesterday, rather than kind of over discourse, if through doing and making you start to contribute and build systems with artists, with communities, with people, which make propositions for how we might do something differently, then they begin to have quite a lot of traction, and they begin to be, they can be models which can then be used to influence and shape other decision making. So, for example, at the moment we have, one of the biggest issues, in all this is housing. Parallel to the story you've told,
real estate,
is the story of real estate. And in a way, in fact, one of the reasons why people can't find a way out of the system is because most people are mortgaged up to the eyeballs. So they're dependent on the system. They'll be really screwed if another, major change in the kind of economic system transpires. So in a way, this issue of housing is a really urgent one, and one in which, for example, in Middlesbrough, the council, etc., haven't got an idea of how to develop it. But in place, systems like the Granby 4 Streets project in Liverpool, again, was like a community ground-up proposition of how you might actually give yourself, affordable housing in a sustainable way. And then similarly in Middlesbrough, we've been working with different groups in the community in basically an area that's been demolished because they were so sort of at a loss to know what to do. They just bulldozed the houses and left it as a wasteland. So in a way, in that gap, so when you can then start to work in these gaps as an institution and say, well, maybe we could come up with an idea about how we actually might build a house here. What about if we, if we start as an institution to get involved in these non-art systems, in these non-art activities, but are essentially cultural activities? This is, in a way, this is real culture. If you want to build and shape culture, you have to do it not just as a gallery in a sort of spectator environment, but as an active agency within civic structure.
It brings. Maybe we can just show one image here, which is this again, the Vanabbemuseum, when we turned it into Museum of Art Utile, and it's something that we're quite common, or we have a lot of shared interests in this term and the question and what it might mean. And I think that for me, what's interesting, if we're to talk about museum programming, for instance, is the idea that a writer called Stephen Wright came up with some time ago in relationship to usership and moving from spectatorship to usership, is this idea of art having a double ontology, which basically means to having two equal, or having purchase equally on two different systems of knowledge at the same time. So an object that has two different status within a system of knowledge, within a matrix at the same time. And so this double ontology would be precisely that it is a work of art, and that it carries that message of a work of art and that tradition of a work of art that we've built up, because we have this narrative of special objects which are protected by art museums. And it continues to have that. It's not about giving that up. So art utile is not necessarily about giving up the possibility of art being art. It's about saying that alongside this capacity of it to be art, it also can be a means. It can be both an end and a means at the same time. And that means can be a means to the kinds of questions in society that we are addressing. And it's not to demean the one by placing it within the context of the other. And there's been this huge desire, I think, on the part, particularly on the part of the market, of course, which wants art to be useless, which wants art not to have function in order to ascribe to it financial function, financial significance. I don't think anybody's going to pray in front of the Leonardo da Vinci that was just sold for 400 million. Yeah, it's functional.
They won't get near it.
They probably won't get near it, no. It's just washing money anyway, so it would have been better if it was 1 billion, really, in terms of the buyer, because the logic at that level is not the logic of buying stuff in Tesco's or whatever. It's a different logic of money. But at that point, I don't think that its use value, and it had use value, of course, when it was, if it's even a Da Vinci, but it had a certain use value when it was painted. That use value has been completely extracted from it. And of course, that's true of all religious work that's now in museums. So that aspect so that has, in a way, a certain double ontology, but that use value is really completely marginalized, yeah? And the system marginalizes it. It extracts it and tries to hide it, tries to bury it, tries to ignore it. And I think that process is something that we're, within Arte Utile, is a sense of actually trying to restore the connection. And not obviously only in religious terms, but also in terms of the potential for art being a tool in which to achieve something else other than itself. So this idea, and arte utile, of course, in the Latin language, utile is close to utensil. Yeah, we have the word in English, so it's like this idea of tool. So you have this art as a tool. It's not only useful art, it's also art as a tool. And I think this art as a tool is something that's very appealing to me because provided this double ontology can exist, yeah, provided this idea that it can be both and
it's important to say here as well,
and it's ambiguous at certain points what its relationship is to the world.
But it's also to state as well that that's also this idea of the use value in art is a suppressed history in art. It's a thread that runs through. I mean,
from Ruskin onwards.
Ruskin was talking about it. Horsfall here in Manchester was talking about it. It was there. Even in the educational systems and institutional systems like the Institute movement. But it was always played down and always suppressed by a dominant market. I mean, even then, in that sort of 19th century moment, we had this suppression of other narratives by a market-driven agenda. But it's, is it worth giving an example, I think, as well? Have you got
the honest shop.
Oh, yeah, that'd be quite a good one. Wait, so this is a project, again, which kind of exemplifies a way of working that actually has impact in the world, beyond representation. So this was a project that we developed in Grisdale in the Lake District, but then it's reproducible, so anyone can do an honest shop. And basically it's a shop that sells products made by local people. They have to be handmade. It can't be kind of commercial, kind of mass-produced, mechanically produced materials. So it's things like, jam, knitting, potatoes grown in the garden, that sort of thing. But it has no staff, it just has a jar. And you put the money in the jar and then you take the product. So it's a very simple mode of operation. And of course, within the context of the community we're living in, we made this shop in a building with a system that 80% of the sales went to the maker, 20% went to the community to do projects. And of course, everybody said it'll never work, because it's outside of shops don't work like this. This is outside of our, the economic system. It's basically it's misbehaving. And it won't work, and people will misbehave in it, and because people always think the worst of everybody. And of course, it's been an amazing success and turns around for kind of like 40, 50,000 pounds a year and generates even pays for somebody, a job for someone in the village to kind of be a community coordinator, etc. And then this was a version, that was set up in the Vanabbemuseum to show that actually, yes, you can. This is not just something that works, is an exception, but actually can start to have roots in the world and start to have effect.
And I think also, and I'm sure that many people in the room have got experience of this, but once you start these kind of projects, then you start to have conversations. And it's really important at that moment to just listen. And what you find is those conversations have very little to do with the overt agendas of what you might think a museum is. This sort of historic agenda that Stephen was talking about a couple of days ago, or yesterday. I think about bringing art to the people or whatever. Yeah? But actually it's about a public space where maybe people need to access that public space because they don't have anything else. And museums are public spaces. They have that capacity to be a place where people can gather. And so at that point, then lots of interesting things start to happen, because just by listening, you start to say, well, maybe we could get involved in that. So we get involved in local producers farming in the wastelands in Eindhoven that haven't yet been built on by the real estate developers. And so that becomes then a way of sort of supporting those activities, and people can meet then in the museum, and it becomes something that the museum can help in the sustainability aspect of it. Maybe we should go to questions.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I mean, in terms of where we've got to, this proposition of the Museum of Public Space is maybe a good place to stop. But do we have any questions from the floor? Yes. Good.
Just to return to the Lowe's cartoon and Brexit and so on that we started with. A quick historical point. I think we're talking about Britain. I think talking about Henry VIII is maybe slightly problematic. And actually, I think we tend to forget that Britain's involvement as part of Europe. We forget the Hanoverian kings. We get that continued right up until 1837 when we shared monarchy with another European state. And actually, I blame Napoleon for the continental system and an awful lot which went on. And the point I'm making about that is that I think the responsibility actually lies there across all of Europe, rather than seeing it as Henry VIII, it's our man who cut ourselves off. But returning to another point, this morning we had a session thinking about the First World War commemoration, and that is so much in line with this. And I've been really quite horrified by the British nationalist approach that's been taken by that. And first of all, obviously your comment would be interesting, but I'd also like just to plead with everybody that we've got the end of the First World War coming up next year. We at least have the opportunity of knowing it's coming, but can we please do something in that last year to try to get away from this British exceptionalism? I mean, we've got this sort of last gasp before we fall off the cliff, and that white cliff metaphor that sits here, I think, is really important to be scared of and do something about, rather than just this, very unthinking nationalism that we seem to be living through.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm not a citizen of this country anymore, so it's hard to comment on it some ways. But I do think that. The Brexit decision's been made, no? So the question is, and I think that you're right in that, like, what do you do in order, not necessarily to mitigate it, but how does it go forward? Because, the rhetoric is maybe one of splendid isolation to some extent, but if you look at the Daily Mail article from 2011, it's about Britain and the open seas. It's about the global Britain, I think they call it. It's about, Empire 2.0, I think, which is the plan at the moment. So clearly there's an idea of rebuilding the overseas empire as a replacement for the European empire, and there are exactly the things that you're talking about in relationship to history, which are the narratives of history which exclude the kind of facts of joint monarchies and all those other interconnections and relationships that even linguistically that exist between parts of the United Kingdom and elsewhere, where Celtic languages or it's Norn in Shetland and Norse or whatever. All these things are actually an alternative narrative that could have been told but got lost because of this narrative, and this blocked it out. And maybe it's interesting to see whether you could relate those narratives around 2018. But I think it doesn't seem to me to be any profit also from a European point of view. Britain's gone already. There's no, the questions that I think the European Union has, and we're busy with, Brussels applications for funding, where, for instance, Middlesbrough is not part of it because there's no point in putting them in because it's a minus point. So it's already gone. So the question is, what do you do here, I guess, having gone, and what do we do there with the 27 states that remain, many of which have huge problems, and those problems need attention. This is a little bit of a sideshow for that issue, I think. But I think in terms of the British question, yeah, I agree with you. I think that what the response is to the condition of splendid isolation is really important, and that response is still open, is still up for grabs. Yeah? There are possibilities to do things within the new condition, and I suppose if I could say anything controversial, I don't know. It annoys me a little bit, this sort of remona, as I think it's called, the remona kind of condition, which just feels a kind of nostalgic moaning for things that have already gone. It's over, so get on with it, I would have thought, and try and build a British future or an independent Scottish future, which I'd like to see myself, that is not part of that story, not part of the moaning.
We've got another question here.
Hi, I'm Tracy Avery. I'm an independent consultant from Australia, but I actually did the Manchester course here years ago and worked in the UK throughout the 90s. That's interesting, I hadn't heard Empire 2.0, but what some of the dialogue about Brexit
I think you're subject to it
in Australia is about, yes, what's going to be the new relationship and the renewed relationship with the Commonwealth. But from the museum point of view, I would still urge museums in Britain to really understand their collections and the impact that colonisation still has on their Commonwealth countries, including their so-called settler societies, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, because we are living with the legacy of British colonisation still, and we are having all the conversations with our own people and our First Peoples that are really important. But when I come and see collections here, there's an absence of any of the understanding about how our Commonwealth countries have really moved on. So it's really about, we'd like to increase the dialogue so that collections here and people here can better understand the positives and the negatives of that legacy. And I think that's a lot of what you've raised, that there needs to be multiple stories about objects.
Yeah, I mean, this is really relevant to me, actually, because we did this show with Daniela Ortiz that Miguel here kind of curated with Daniela recently, and part of that was remaking a book from 1899, which was basically this children's book of how to be a sort of colonial dominatrix, well, we're not in that way, sorry. That's another book. And basically the exhibition kind of got raided by the police because someone complained saying it was racist to white people, the show. Because and in the end we had this discussion and it was great and it's very fruitful. But the one thing, interestingly, that that one of the policemen who was the hate crime officer for the region picked up on. He was wasn't bothered about, he's saying, okay, you can understand different viewpoints, blah, blah, blah. But then he picked up on and said, yeah, but this thing about Captain Cook, who's like the son of Middlesbrough, he's the man in Middlesbrough. He said, you can't say that about Captain Cook. He was just a biologist. And so when you've got the hate crime officer in Middlesbrough saying Captain Cook was just a biologist, we're not doing our job as a museum. We're really not. And the Captain Cook Museum in Middlesbrough, is not doing its job, and it's not fair to our our counterparts in Australia and all those communities to suppress these stories. And I think exactly as Charles was saying before, I think it is that moment that we have to open the can of worms and get it out there, and it's the job of museums to do that, because I don't know where else it's going to do. It'll be interesting to see with the keynote on the New Civilization series this afternoon, what the plans are in terms of TV broadcast for telling these stories, because, I think I'll go to that one.
I was just wondering, because I think essentially, Charles, what you were saying too is that even if there is a less bad outcome, Britain as a PR entity is pretty well shot because of the stance that it's taking. But is there any, perhaps not, well, maybe this is a naive hope that, and city-centric, but if there's an element of returning to the European city-states where there's a super-national idea where cities can connect, perhaps with culture at the fore, and go back to that stage of having that supranational identity of connecting with each other and culture being writ large.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds nice. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think one of the problems is that, one of the mistakes that the European Union maybe made, I think because they grounded, particularly after 1992, which was partly, if we remember, in the history of the 80s, the vetoing of the president of the European Economic Community, I think at the time, Jacques Delors, by the British, was one of the moments where the market fully ran into control. There was still a social democratic, and I'm not a social democrat at all, but there was still a social democratic possibility in Europe in the 80s, and that was vetoed by the British. That's why I'm a bit optimistic that the absence of the British might allow that kind of development to happen, maybe. But I think that wouldn't have happened before. But So Brexit gives more possibility for that than less within Europe, I think, slightly, at least for the hardcore of Europe within that Western colonialist states. I would say that one of the mistakes that the European Union made, perhaps, and this would of course be very problematic to say here, is that they didn't Europeanize the school curriculums. So what happened was that the school curriculums remained at the nation-state level. And that's one of the ways in which nation-state loyalties are inculcated into the citizens of those states. So the European Union citizenship didn't mean anything at that point. And I think if you look at most, and it's true in the Netherlands, and I'm sure it's true here, that the histories that are learnt are not European histories, but are national histories. And they're national histories, they're not city histories as well. So the loyalties that you have are built around nations, and of course UK, because it's this sort of pretend multinational state that isn't really accepted as a multinational state by the biggest state in it, but anyway, that's another question. But there are differences between Scottish and the English education system, I know, but nevertheless, largely, there's the existing nation states built their narrative of who we are around the nation state. And I think that's always the problem that you're going to face. The nation state will not allow those things to happen. So those relationships will be forbidden at a certain level if they get too much out of control. They'll be encouraged when it's European City of Culture or something like that, because that's the nation states competing against each other. That's the Olympics model. But I think at the point which I would like to see reached, perhaps, and perhaps you would like to see reached as well, in terms of that openness of city-states. You're talking about the city-state no longer being dependent upon the nation-state narrative, and that seems a long way away, and would need European support, and would need a reduction in, would need exactly the kind of generational change that would be represented by, say, a European curriculum at certain levels, and also perhaps European institutions. If the Tate had been a European institution rather than a British institution, funded by and supported by the EU rather than by the British government, we might be in a different stage now. That's true for the Rijksmuseum, where I'm from, or from the Preußische Besitzung in Berlin. If they had been European, if Centre Pompidou had been European, there might have been an element of a different relationship to say this is what Europe allows us to do.
Or Eurasian.
Or Europe. I mean, the European Union is fine. It's just Europe isn't a continent, it's a subcontinent, but that's another issue.
We're over our time, sadly.
Very good.
But at least we've got an action point,
yes.
which is to change the curriculum.
Good, one. Tick.
But Charles, thank you very much.
Thank you, Alistair.
We'll continue this conversation, I'm sure.
Thanks a lot.
Okay, thank you.